Rejestrując się w platformie gamerhash.co, twój komputer będzie dla ciebie zarabiał. Zarobione środki wymienisz w sklepie internetowym. Zacznij już dziś zarabiać na mocy obliczeniowej swojego komputera.
Siemeczka, z tej strony Mitrox i zapraszam was serdecznie na kanale. W pierwszym odcinku widzicie po raz kolejny i już tym bardziej po raz ostatni grze BioShock Remastered. W poprzednim odcinku eskortowaliśmy małą siostrę, pozyskaliśmy specjalną broń, która pozwoli na zabójstwo Adama. Aktualnie mamy dość mało amunicji, też mało pieniędzy, ale mam nadzieję, że damy radę go pokonać. Mam planarze mieć wyekwipowane Winter Blast i będziemy go na razie atakować, tak mi się wydaje, z kuszy. Bo gdy go zamrozimy, to możemy go nieźle poatakować właśnie z tej broni. Albo jeszcze możemy z granatniku, bo mamy no łącznie 2, 8, 11 pocisków. Jeszcze mamy Exploding i Electric Bucky. Co na razie będziemy grać normalnymi. Lecimy. Zapisik był robiony 2 razy na szczęście. Jak na wszelki wypadek i zobaczymy, jak to wyjdzie. I też w poprzednim odcinku sporo ulepszyliśmy naszej postaci. Chyba wykupiliśmy wszystkie ulepszenia, jakie mogłem w jednej stacji za chyba 1100 esencji.
I remember when me and the crowd put you in that sub. You were no more than 2. You were my ace in the hole, but you were also the closest thing I ever had to a son. And that's why this hurts. Betrayal, kid. Life ain't strictly business.
Czyli Vita Chamber, się odradzamy tam. To już wiadomo, po co to tam stoi. Tam, czyli w niektórych elementach gry. Oj. To jest Adam.
Go! Go now! Hit him with the needle!
Aha. No powiem, że w porządku system walki. Ciekawa postać akurat.
You think you got a shot at this? I'm barely getting started.
You think I'm alone in this world? I got more than enough mobs to watch my back while I recharge.
Catch my breath. And I'm gonna bury you and all this. Need a minute. Then cut you. I had you built. I sent you topside. I called you back, showed you what you was capable of. Even that life you thought you had, that was something I dreamed up and had tattooed inside your head. Now if you don't call that family, I don't know what is. And now...
They offered you everything, yes.
And in return, you gave them what I have come to expect of you. Brutality. You took what you wanted. All the Adam, all the power. And the rapture trembled. But in the end, even the rapture was not enough for you. Your father was terrified the world would try to steal the secrets of his city. But not you, for now you have stolen the terrible secrets of the world.
No, czyli odcinek dość krótki, ale nie spodziewałem się, że to tak szybko pójdzie. Okazuje się, że mamy najgorsze zakończenie. Przynajmniej tak mi się wydaje, że najgorsze, no bo jednak niepotrzebnie pozyskiwałem tą całą energię z tych sióstr, chociaż w sumie no to było tylko pozyskanie, na przykład zabójstwo. Ciekawe mnie co w wypadku by było, gdybyśmy ratowali te małe siostry od tych Big Daddy. Pozyskiwalibyśmy dalej na pewno energii, no bo jednak to był dość mocny element gry, tylko pewnie byłaby jakaś alternatywa do tego, tak jak to Tannenberg nam mówiła. Na razie to spróbuję zobaczyć wszystkie zakończenia, bo wydaje mi się, że raczej powinny być tylko dwa. Aha, czyli mam w sumie 3 zakończenia. Jeżeli zdecydujemy się ratować małe siostry, jeżeli zdecydujemy się tak jakby zabijać, a w zasadzie pozyskiwać energię z tych małych sióstr i jeżeli zdecydujemy się na pozyskiwanie i ratowanie, czyli tak jakby pół na pół, tylko pewnie to zależy od tego, ile tych sióstr spotkamy. W samym opisie gry jest mowa o tym, że są 3 różne zakończenia. Wszystkie zależą od tego, jak będziemy traktować małe siostry, które spotkamy przez całą grę. Wszystkie małe siostry były kiedyś normalnymi ludzkimi dziewczynkami, ale były użyte jako zbiornik energii, który nazywał się, w zasadzie z surowca, który nazywał się Adam. Aha! To już to wszystko zmienia. Jeszcze jest informacja o tym, że jest 21 sióstr łącznie, które mogą być albo pozyskane, albo uratowane. Jeżeli wszystkie 21 sióstr pozyskamy, to będziemy mieć w sumie ponad 3000 energii. Mi się wydaje, że ja miałem najwięcej 1100, plus wcześniej to mogłem mieć, no tak mi się wydaje, z 1500, 1700 może tej energii, więc nieźle to było. I tutaj jeszcze jest mowa o Big Daddy, tylko że byli strażnikami, tak jakby tej esencji Adama, czyli byli strażnikami tych małych sióstr. Mowa jest o tym, że są specjalnie dostrojeni, wyposażeni w te całe sprzęty i tak dalej. No powiem, że kurczę, nieźle to wyglądało. Sama gra nie zajęła mi dużo godzin, wydaje mi się, że coś koło 6, nie, wydaje mi się, że chyba coś koło 5 się zmieściłem. Widziałem przejścia, które trwały około 8 bądź 7,5, więc jestem szczerze zaskoczony tym, że tak szybko mi poszło. Grałem oczywiście na łatwym poziomie trudności, przez co no ciężko nie było, można by powiedzieć. O, i bez napisów, to znaczy bez żadnej scenki po napisach końcowych. Spodziewałem się, że będzie ciężej, jeżeli chodzi o samo odnajdywanie, no bo jednak gra jest starszej, można powiedzieć, że generacji, jak to bardziej łamigłówki były na topie, jak i znajdowanie własnego szlaku, ale akurat według mnie było tutaj to wszystko ładnie powiedziane dzięki mechanice pod H, czyli pozyskiwaniu hintów, czyli pewnie podpowiedzi, które były czasem pomocem, jednak dawały nam obrys tego, gdzie mamy czegoś szukać, jak tego mamy szukać, tylko według mnie powinno to być jeszcze pokazane na minimapce, według mnie to byłoby naprawdę bardzo fajne, albo chociażby na tej mapie głównej, którą mieliśmy pod M. Dziwne dla mnie było to, że mieliśmy pod Shiftem wszystkie te nasze, tak jakby, umiejętności, które mogliśmy sobie wybierać, ale na przykład nie mieliśmy wglądu do naszych umiejętności typu fizycznych, inżyniera i jakichś tam innych jeżdżek. Musieliśmy mieć specjalne Gene Station, aby móc w ogóle zmieniać te wszystkie umiejętności, a żadnego podglądu niestety nie było, chyba że to ja jakiegoś klawiszu nie zauważyłem. Powiem, że same bronie były naprawdę fajnie zrobione, nie wiem czy wszystkie zauważyłem, czy może jakieś pominąłem, wydaje mi się, że raczej nie, dlatego że slotów było akurat tyle, ile potrzeba było. Zobaczymy jeszcze tutaj komentarz. O, sporo tego pominąłem, chyba tak, pominąłem. To nie będzie może to.
Rapture is overflowing with memorable locations and set pieces. In developing a world that feels organic, lived in, and functional, Irrational managed to create a space that feels perfectly suited to the story and action that takes place in it, which begs a question: did the plot shape the location, or did the plot fit squarely into a world that was already established? Let's talk about some of the areas in Rapture, because it's an amazing place, but also it feels like there's certain areas that are very well designed, that they have, you know, there's a certain aesthetic and the characters in there, it all kind of comes together. Ken, do you have a part of Rapture that resonates the most with you still to this day?
I think the opening is always going to be the most important to me because it's we spent a lot of time there, and it was all for me as a challenge as a narrative guy is sort of how do we set up a very complex series of events and a very complex notion and all this, you know, Andrew, there's so much to tell, Big Daddies and Little Sisters and Andrew Ryan and the time period and do that all without cutscenes. And especially, I think, the descent to Rapture when you're in that, when you go in the bathysphere, you know, getting that right, getting everything right down to the, you know, the bathysphere, cresting the hill and seeing the city for the first time. Remember how much we worked on the timing of that, just getting that.
And it took us forever to figure out that we should just put the slide projector covering the window. Like, again, in hindsight, it seems like such an obvious choice, but we were really trying to figure out, like, how are we going to tell this story of Ryan and then reveal so you can see the, you know, the city beyond the hill.
And also we didn't have to show the whole transition going down the bottom of the ocean because the whole screen was covered.
Spoiler alert.
I think that's the part that will always be near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I mean, for me it was Kashmir. That was one of the first...
The restaurant at the beginning.
Yeah, the restaurant at the beginning, because it was really like the first art box that we created that was Rapture. I mean, we created spaces before that weren't really hitting the Art Deco look. Scott Sinclair just started, and he built that, designed and built that statue of the Atlas with the world on his shoulders that was in the middle of the room. And Mauricio had done some concept art for us of that space. And once we started putting everything together and getting it into engine and actually walking around it and seeing those giant windows off to the side that just showed the seascape and really drove home the fact that you were underwater. It was the first time really all the elements started to come together.
And we had built a bunch of stuff, and we actually stepped back and said, we have to just get one room right before we go any further, because we weren't getting it right. And so Mauricio did that concept drawing.
Yep.
We worked really hard on that statue, and that statue I think was the first object we really built in the game that was a BioShock. So we just stayed in that room for like a month until we got it right.
And I think the original concept actually had a tram running through
it
it,
did.
so it was like even more complicated, and that was one of those things where we had to keep pulling back to really focus on what the bare essence of that room was.
Were there parts of Rapture that you never were able to realize that you sort of still miss?
Zoo.
The zoo. People
We had a zoo
frolic, right?
that I was excited about. Not everybody was excited about the zoo, but I don't know why I was excited about the zoo, because it would have been a nightmare. We had another area that was prior to Arcadia that was more of a straight up agriculture, forest type of area.
Before we had the bathyspheres, we had a whole sort of subway transport system in Rapture, which we spent a lot of time thinking about, and then just realized that these little submersibles would be a much more realistic and much better solution.
And you were going to be able to move between locations in that subway system?
Yeah, much like the bathyspheres, but they were much more integrated throughout the space, and we really want to support them. And we just realized it was not really relevant to what we were doing.
Were there certain locations or areas where you knew a certain narrative point, you know, needed to happen? Like you look at, you know, the reveal of sort of Atlas's true motivations. Like, was that like, oh, we've got to do it this part, this level, because it fits the story? or was it more that you sort of like you had the game laid out in a certain order and you just layered the story on top of it?
I think the big one I can think of is that you encounter Ryan in his sort of like that he would live in an area of industry.
Okay.
You know, so he lives in this very industrial area because that's where he would feel most comfortable. And that we wanted his office, his lair, to sort of be not in some, you know, residential zone, but where he wants to wake up and smell the grease fires and, you know, and the machines and the smoke. That's in his lifeblood. Industry is his lifeblood.
It also had to be very theatrical. Like if you look at it now, it doesn't look like an office. You kind of know it's an office because the story is telling you that. And we had some old technology that was laying around in the game that would control environment settings. So the old system that we had would let you do high pressure, low pressure, medium pressure. And those would affect lighting and other like post-process things in the world. And that was a system that was cut, but because the code was in, we were always trying to figure out ways to use it. And one of the ways that we used it was in the Andrew Ryan sequence, because we didn't have a lot of narrative storytelling tools. We were basically switching the atmosphere to get all the lighting changes. So whenever a light changes in that scene, we're telling the game that the atmosphere is changing. So, and then the preset atmospheres come in and shine the spotlights on them or bring up the house lights when we need them to.
Very, very early on, you could change the pressure in the areas, and that would change how explosions work and all this stuff like that. And we just couldn't figure out how to make it gettable for the player. We couldn't make it feedback, but we still had all those. That moved a lot of levers in the game, so we still had the system. So we used it for the sort of theatrical cues of, very theatrical cues of Ryan appearing, the lights going down where you are, and the lights coming up where he is, because the engine didn't have those tools by default.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
And there was a great sense of sort of artistic progression as you went through the game too, and that each level had its own sort of voice. Was that something that a lot of games as they move further in development, it's like, oh, we sort of ran out of time. We can, it's like we're just going to sort of repeat this and change the color palette. It felt like, for the team, it was very defined from early on that you wanted each sort of level, which they were levels back in the day, to feel distinct.
Yeah, we had sort of experimented with that back on System Shock 2, back when every Doom level looked pretty much like every other Doom level, because they were just working on the same set of assets. We decided with our very rudimentary tools in System Shock 2 that we would progress with color, and every deck would feel different from a color standpoint, even though most of that was lighting, or textures, nothing really more. But we had the tools to actually, sort of theme levels. I think a lot of this goes back to, I think my first memory was actually from when I was 1 year old at the Montreal World Expo.
Remember when you were one?
Well, I remember being at something at this World's Fair, which I didn't realize, I think was in 1967, when I was 1 year old, a little over 1 year old. And I was on a theme park ride that they had and I remember being at this thing where a big bat flies out of this sort of thing and comes up. I don't know why I was a 1 year old was on this ride. I'm not sure, sort of a haunted housey kind of ride. And I remember loving it. And I think that stuck with me. So the notion of sort of theme parky themes and settings, and Disney World does a great job with some of Disney World. They theme areas. So themed areas were something that always resonated with me. And BioShock sort of always has had this notion of feeling of theme in different areas, much more than the real world has. Like you walk from building to building, then you can't really tell them apart. You walk from walk from a floor of an office building to another floor. It's not going to look any different, but we always felt that really important.
And it's also, if you look at SWAT 4, saw some early experiments with this, especially like the serial killer's house level in SWAT 4, which is probably one of the most dense levels that we ship, but you were trying to tell a specific story with that. And going straight into BioShock and using the same exact engine that we're using, and we were very comfortable at that point with how the engine worked and how to art up these rooms, gave us a leg up when we sat down and really thought about what stories are we specifically trying to tell. And one of my favorite anecdotes from this time period is with Sander Cohen. I think it was Nate Wells and Stephen Alexander sat down one night, and they came up with a backstory for every dead body that you find in that space, and then they told that story with the props that they could. Even if it was just like, this guy crawled 3 feet and then shot himself in the head because he was sad about something, you know, they put those marks in, maybe put a picture next to the guy, and then he shot himself. So they really like did their homework and tried to add, you know, the backstory for everything that you're going to find in that space.
I've got Atlas's goons hitting us non-stop and 2 dead mechanics just this week. We need to control costs. If I wanted to deal with amateurs, I would have stayed on dry land.
Dobrze, było to ciekawe. Jeszcze później sobie pytanie o moralność.
To kill, excuse me, to harvest or not to harvest. The moral dilemma that follows you throughout the BioShock experience and defines the fate of the player. This choice lays at the center of your BioShock story and has repercussions that can be felt in nearly every facet of the gameplay. Part of BioShock's lasting legacy, of course, are the Little Sisters and this moral choice that presented itself to the player. You know, everyone, it became a water cooler conversation about like, well, did you save them, did you harvest them? That concept, Ken, was that something that came about early in development, or that binary choice? When did that come into the game?
I don't remember when. I mean, we had the concept of them being protected, but I can't remember when you
Yeah, it
actually
certainly
chose.
wasn't, when there were slugs, it was not meaningful. I think there was,
Do you salt it? Do you
Slot.
not salt
yeah,
it?
there were resources that you could get, but there was no choice there, right? It was, the choice was, do I want to fight the Big Daddy or not?
Yeah.
I think once we got into the realm of, they have to be empathetic, the player has to have some feeling towards them, which you're not going to get from slugs.
Right.
Then we start seeing that opportunity there of like, okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they? Like, and do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came up that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where, like, you know, where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is, that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. In this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially. Are you willing to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys, and go, do this. And I only had a few, the press, and this sort of happens over and over again. The games press worried a ton about it, and like would wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a setting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose. That it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children. And
Whatever, and that was a sensitivity. I know that, like, you guys wanted to call them little sisters, not little girls, and it was and it wasn't, it wasn't killing them, it was harvesting them. And I mean, you did some things probably on purpose, right, to sort of explain that this, you weren't doing anything vicious to them, right?
Well, I mean, you do sort of, they do sort of disappear out of you, and a big slug out of their belly, comes up that you. Well, we didn't want that to be graphic. We wanted to be very clear that you were killing them.
Yeah.
But it was not intended to be a prurient in terms of, hey, this is a simulation of pulling a sea slug out of a little girl's belly. But we wanted you to understand that you were making a very diabolical moral economic pact there. And we think that came across, and I think it came across well enough. And I think the test of how well it came across is, I think most people didn't really thought of it as am I willing to do this thing or not?
Right.
And people would tell us stories how, like, their girlfriend saw them harvesting, and then they literally slept on the couch that night.
Right.
And that's an interesting, that was interesting how people connected to a 3D mesh that's really no different than any other 3D mesh in the world. Like, this little sister, she's not a person. She's a 3D asset, a virtual 3D asset, right? That has a voice actor connected to it, who's an adult woman, and nobody was actually getting harmed, but people still emotionally connected to them and made an emotional connection.
And also, I think when you're playing, you don't really know what the impact of that choice is.
Yes.
And that's sort of the, you know, the curiosity of like, well, you know, you're a gamer, so it's like, am I going to game the system? Which one should I pick? How does this impact things as you go through the game? It's never really fully clear what that choice is going to lead to, right? And the ambiguousness of that was something you wanted to sort of create mystery around throughout the game?
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were much more, should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting, just to really sort of put you up against the wall, push you up against the wall and say, you know, are you going to stick by your moral guns here? Because you're going to pay for it. Because that's usually the way life is, right? It's always harder to take a moral path than it is to take an amoral path. But there's incentives to take amoral paths because it's the easier path.
As you play through the game, eventually you get to the ending, and as we know now, there were sort of two endings that you know, were affected by that choice. And that was something at the time, I know you said publicly that you weren't in favor of sort of having two endings. Was that in part because, you know, the game is about not having choice, or did you think that, you know, the two endings were, I don't know, like, I'm interested for narratively, like, why you didn't want to go that path?
It seemed forced, given that the game really sort of almost made a joke, I mean a meta commentary joke about the lack of agency in games, the lack of meaning of those choices, given that you have these two endings. I guess you could make an argument that, well, you were given choice of the, you know, once Ryan's dead, and that's really what it's about. But I think we also didn't really have enough time to execute on those super well. I was pretty happy with how the happier one came out, you know, with the sort of little sister focus, but it's a much more subtle story than I would have time to tell about sort of your slow descent into, you know, moral chaos and dissolute living and all the things that sort of come along with a life that is sort of separate from a moral structure. It's a long story.
And so, I mean, you were just switching a cutscene. It wasn't like you were doing sort of a whole other level that was different or something. So the choice was,
there's two cutscenes with very tight time and
or just start a nuclear war.
Yes. And that's not, you know,
you're a nice guy, or you start a nuclear war.
And because we had so many problems on our plate, that was something I had to sort of do in the spare time. So I was pretty happy with one, but not very happy with the other.
I know you had said publicly before that there was another sort of more ambiguous ending that you had originally planned, or what would you have done?
There was a notion of an ambiguous ending, which if I just wrote one, I would have found a way that would just talk about the moral ambiguity of the world rather than the sort of, you know, positive or negative, because it is such a, look, I think we really tried with BioShock not to sort of make a game about good and evil. It is really about circumstances and what circumstances lead people to, and how they delude themselves with ideology to do things that they would think are evil, but it's okay because it's for a good cause. And that's what I probably would have. If I just had one to write, I'd probably focus more on that. You know, how difficult it is to sort of align when you start being driven by ideology rather than being in the moment and thinking about the impact of what you're doing.
Sean, you talked to gamers, I'm sure, over the years. Did you ever get a sense of how many people harvested versus saved, or was there any sort of data? I mean, this is before the days where you get telemetry and data on like what people picked and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, it seems like more people saving little sisters. Although, I have a few friends that I just harvested every single one. I wanted to see what happened. So, I mean, I don't know if that was more, you know, the game developer and them trying to see, you know, what would happen, but certainly for the most part, I think most people, which I guess is a good thing. It means that maybe people are good at heart. You know, they kind of feel bad. They want they want to save the little sisters. So, yeah, I'll say it. You know, the needle sways towards the green there.
Time for bed, Mr. B. Hurry, Mr. Bubbles.
No dobrze, fajnie to wyglądało, muszę przyznać. Dobra, akurat komentarz grał mi się naprawdę świetnie. Teraz się zorientowałem, kiedy to w sumie 5 godzin mi tak szybko minęło. Jedyne trudności, jakie miałem, to czasem z poruszaniem się, gdzie mam pójść, co akurat było łatwo do zauważenia, szczególnie w elementach gry, gdy miałem za zadanie znaleźć odpowiednie części, na przykład, nie wiem, jakieś tam feromony, nie feromony, strój, tak jak w poprzednim odcinku pana Bubble, jak to te Little Sister nazywają, a to nie było jakoś też wybitnie ciężko, tylko trochę się rozejrzeć, mniej więcej zapamiętać, gdzie się już było i po prostu iść przed siebie i czekać, aż będzie mniej więcej jakaś kwestia dialogowa związana z postacią fabularną, która nam podpowiada, bądź jest oczywiście złym bohaterem. Powiem, że zakończenie fajne. Zobaczę na YouTube, jak wygląda dobre, jak i to takie pośrednie zakończenie, jeżeli jest jakakolwiek różnica. Teraz będę ogrywał sobie 2, jak i Infinite następnego odcinka. Siemka.